So the lecture is one of the key initiatives of the Rodolfo Debenedetti Foundation, which promotes applied research on themes related to labor market and welfare systems. And Hilary's work fits really well with the aim of these lectures. So it's a privilege to add her name to the list of distinguished speakers who've delivered these lectures in the past. So Hilary is a professor of economics and public policy at the University of California, Berkeley. She holds a distinguished chair in economic disparities, and before joining Berkeley, she was professor of economics at UC Davis. She received her PhD from Stanford in '92, and she holds several very prestigious roles. She's co-editor of the American Economic Review, which, as we know, is the leading economics journal. She sits on the NSF Advisory Committee for Social Sciences and on the Advisory Committee of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is the largest philanthropy in the United States on issues of public health. So Hilary is considered an authority on matters related to welfare and low-income tax policy, low-skilled labor markets, and government transfer programs. Her research has a very clear overarching theme, which is what are the impact of government transfer programs on low-income families, and how do these policies affect poverty and inequality. She has made very important contributions to the study of the largest transfer programs in the US, and typically the insight in her work has been to go beyond mean effects and look at distributional impacts of these programs. And then if you go beyond these mean effects, you may find surprising results. That's a little bit the flavor of the work that Hilary has done. So I'd like to give you just a couple of examples so that you can put these in perspectives, and then we can move to the lecture. So one of her early contributions, which has been very influential, was a study on the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is the largest cash transfer program for low-income families with children in the US. Now, the common wisdom with this program is that because it's, an earned income tax credit, it should encourage work, as opposed to disincentivizing labor supply, as some of the traditional welfare schemes do. So, and indeed, if you look at the impact of the program, you see that it promoted increased labor supply among unmarried women with children. But Hilary's hint was the following. So the way the program is targeted is based on family income. So we could think that there will be disincentive effects on labor supply for secondary income earners. And in fact, what she finds in her work is that while overall, the labor participation of married men has gone up, that of married women has gone down even more, so that the total labor supply in married couples has decreased. And we end up with a conclusion that this program effectively subsidized married mothers who stayed home, which was very different from the conventional wisdom with which the program had been promoted. So this type of research is, I think, a very nice approach to tackling important issues in public policy, but trying to understand, what are the effects if we go beyond the first order, most intuitive results. Another example comes from the food stamp program, a huge program for increasing food consumption of low-income families in the US. And again, here the common view would be that because this is an in-kind transfer, it's desirable because you're helping poor people to spend income on the right things, like food, as opposed to the wrong things, like, alcohol or cigarettes or the like. And then the existing literature using certain methodologies that may or may not be debatable, did find that, every dollar of income, food stamp that you were given were generating more consumption in food compared to $1 just in cash. Now, what Hilary did was she said, well, first of all, from a theoretical point of view, it's not obvious that this should be the case if you look at inframarginal households. So for inframarginal households, the marginal propensity to consume might be similar across the two types. Also, methodologically, instead of comparing recipients and not recipients, which poses some problems, she used phasing of the program to kind of improve on the identification strategy, and it turns out that the result she got was that on average these propensities, marginal propensities to consume, were not so different when you took this approach if you compare food stamps or cash transfers. So again, this is a sort of a bold statement which goes against some common wisdom, but it's important if we want to understand how these transfer programs really work. So as I said, these are just two examples. Today's lecture will summarize Hilary's recent work on the Great Recession and the social safety net. And there will be, as you'll see, particular emphasis on distributional impact. So which groups suffered the most during the Great Recession? Did the social safety net protect the most vulnerable against poverty? And, these are really fundamental questions, and we are very happy to hear Hilary's take on them and her answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a great introduction. It's really wonderful to be here. Over the years of my 20 or more years training PhD students in the United States, I've met many, many incredibly wonderful, skilled, talented Bocconi students. So it's a pleasure to see many out there in the room. It's great to be here. And I may be wrong, because you might not have a list of all the speakers who've ever given this lecture on your website, but it's possible that I'm the first woman to give the lecture. I don't know. That's what I saw from what I saw. So I'm happy to be here. But I might be wrong. Okay, so let's see. Is the talk somewhere else here? If Roberta's gone, we're all in big trouble. That's all I'm saying. Here we go. No? Let's see. That looks like mine. Here we go. No problem. So, as was mentioned, what I want to talk about today is, in a way, thinking about the Great Recession as a motivation for checking in on how the social safety net is doing. After all, the Great Recession led to a historic decline in employment and increase in unemployment in the United States and many other places. And in the decades prior to the Great Recession, really since the early 1980s was the last time in the United States we saw a severe economic recession, many things had changed in the social safety net in the United States. And so my motivating interest as someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about the disadvantaged population and the design of the social safety net, this seemed like a good opportunity to say, okay, we had this incredible crisis. What happened? And can we use the lens of history to say, what would we have expected to happen to, say, poverty and lower tail inequality if the social safety net had maybe not changed as much as it had in the 2 decades in between the severe downturn in the early 1980s and the Great Recession? And then looking forward, to what extent can the lessons of the Great Recession be to point out what parts of the safety net are doing a pretty good job, and maybe what parts of the safety net need a bit more shoring up? So that was the lens with which I went into thinking about really a series of papers, and I'm drawing on different work in the course of this talk. So the motivating Great Recession setting itself, there was certainly a very large reaction of the social safety net in the Great Recession in the United States has been well documented. We had this historically long expansion of unemployment benefits up to 99 weeks when normal unemployment benefits would have maybe been to 26 weeks. And at the peak of the Great Recession, about 1 in 7 families in the United States was receiving food stamps, which you really just want to think of as a basic fundamental cash safety net program that happens to take the form of food vouchers. But it's really a means-tested income assistance program. And with this context of this intense utilization of the social safety net, what can we say about how effective it was? How different is what the protection that the social safety net was providing compared to what we might have expected from the historical relationship between cycles and the social safety net? So I want to just start by, showing you some basic descriptions of what the Great Recession looked like in the United States and how its effects were felt differentially across groups. And then, because I assume many of you don't necessarily know that much about the social safety net in the U.S. context, I'll talk a little bit about that and the important sort of milestones for change, both before the Great Recession and then, importantly, in the stimulus and the reaction to the Great Recession. And then we'll talk about the sort of main results about comparing history to the Great Recession on the social safety net and in particular on poverty, as my lens here is going to be on the disadvantaged population, and then again end with thinking about what the lessons are moving forward about policy. So this is a sort of starting point, and we can see here just by taking all the recessions, the major recessions from 1980 forward, and putting them all on the same timeline as months from the official NBR dating of the recession. And what you can see from the blue line and the Great Recession is both, and this is employment, and then this is the same graph looking at the monthly unemployment rate. You can see that the Great Recession was both especially with respect to employment, but also with respect to unemployment, a very severe increase, but also one that has taken a very long time to return to normal from. And that's especially apparent when looking at the employment graph and how much longer it's taken to get back to normal or the pre-recession levels compared to earlier recessions. So that is sort of a starting point. In some earlier work, I sort of took that analysis and comparison across recessions and asked the question, to what extent who was affected by the Great Recession different from what we've seen in history? Certainly in the press, there was a lot of attention to the fact that the Great Recession was different. There was a lot of attention to the fact that white-collar workers lost their jobs at perhaps a higher rate than blue-collar workers who traditionally are more affected. There was a lot of attention to what was called a man-session. I don't know if that term was used in Europe at all, and I was sitting here thinking, recessions are always man-sessions. What's different? In other words, affecting men more than women, so a man session. And so with some colleagues, I pooled data from the 80s through the current period and basically tested whether or not the whether the effect of unemployment, the shock to the labor market, was different across groups differentially between the Great Recession and the early 1980s recession. And the answer was basically no. We couldn't reject that the responses to a unit change in the cycle across groups was different. And what you find virtually across all countries is that young persons are more affected, men are more affected than women, racial and ethnic minorities are affected more than whites, and those with lower education levels. So to just illustrate a little bit of that, this graph shows each one of the points is from a different regression, in this case, different age by age, single year of age cells. And each one of these tells you the effect of a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate of the sector as a whole. In this case, we're looking at cycles sort of across states and over time. In the United States, there's a lot of variability in the extent, timing, and severity of cycles across U.S. states. So it's common to use variation across these regions, of which there are many, 50 states, in order to identify the effect of cycles while controlling for sort of secular trends. And what you can see here, this is just pooling the entire time period. If the dots are above the red line, then then that group is more affected than average by a change in unemployment. And if the points are below the red line, then they're less affected. And so you can just simply see that the youth are affected the most on a percentage basis, and the older workers are affected less. And that pattern was very, I'm not showing it here, but that pattern was very similar, almost identical in the Great Recession to the earlier periods. Secondly, we can see the differences across groups. This is just breaking the sample up by race, ethnicity, and gender. And what you can see is that men are affected more than women. This is showing the same thing, a 1 percentage point increase in unemployment rate on the percent effect on effects across groups. And you can see that women are always less affected than men. And whites are less affected than racial and ethnic minorities. And those patterns were, again, very consistent in the Great Recession compared to the earlier time period. And then lastly, and quite dramatically, you see this very well-established, again, across countries, education gradient in your exposure to cyclical fluctuations. In the U.S. context, a lot of these different patterns across these groups are affected by the biggest structural explanation is differential industrial participation. So men are more likely to be employed in construction and manufacturing, which are much more volatile. Women are more likely to be employed in services, which is less cyclical. So part of this is really an industry story. But whatever that is, it's very persistent across the decades, which surprised me a little bit. I thought with the great increase in women participating in the labor market between 1950 and 2010, the great increase in labor force participation, that somehow women would look a bit more like men in terms of their responsiveness to the cycle. That was something I went into the study thinking that would be true, but it turns out that they tend to still be distributed sort of similarly across industries. At least I think that's part of the story. So that's just sort of the backdrop for the interest in this setting. So let me just spend a few minutes telling you about the strange idiosyncratic system of social safety net in the United States. And just as a starting point, this is my way of just sort of organizing the timeline of both what the key programs that we have, and I'm not going to talk about all these today, but just to give you some sense of how recent they are, when they came to be. The first phase of the growth of the social safety net in the United States was in the Great Depression, and mostly that was the emergence of the core sort of social insurance program. We've got the basic public pension program through Social Security. We've got the basic, cycle insurance program through unemployment insurance, and the basic income assistance program through AFDC, which is a cash welfare program specifically targeted to single mothers who at that time were mostly women for whom their husband had died, because there wasn't a lot of children before marriage in the 1930s in the United States. It was primarily women whose husbands had died. And the culture at the time was the view that women with children should not necessarily be participating in the labor market. So this was the sort of state protection to provide a sort of, not a necessarily very high level of support, but a level of support protecting that state of the world. Nothing really much happened until the so-called Great Society period of the 60s and 70s, where we saw the growth of disability programs, the growth of some, while not by European standards, the public health insurance programs that we have for the elderly and the low-income population. And then not really much happened until the 1990s. And this is really the motivating period of what I want to talk about today, which is essentially the decline of cash welfare, which started back there in the 1930s, and the growth of the in-work safety net to replace the out-of-work safety net. So between the 30s and the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we suddenly were in a new world where the expectation is that women were working, and by practice, many women with young children were naturally participating in the labor market. So as you had a social safety net that was focused on single mothers, without providing much incentive to enter the labor market, there sort of grew this disenchantment with the idea of cash cash welfare. And so essentially our cash welfare system was shrunk, and we replaced it with what is now a much larger and more expensive in-work safety net program. And it's that sort of transformation from the out-of-work safety net to the in-work safety net that sort of motivated my interest in saying, wow, welfare is gone now. I wonder how that affected how folks were doing in the Great Recession, given that one critical element of the safety net, even if it was not very generous, and even if at a maximum less than 10% of the population participated in it at any point in time, it still, in my view, was serving a pretty critical purpose. And so that's a large part of the motivation for what I'm talking about in this lecture. And then not much happened until our recent health insurance expansion under Obama, so-called termed Obamacare. So I talked a little bit about cash welfare, and after the program was dramatically reformed in the 1990s, it's now known as TANF, and I'll talk more about that in just a second. Food stamps is sort of a strange thing for a developed country to have, but what you want to think about it as is basic cash assistance if you have low income. It's structured like a traditional welfare program, which means it's providing a floor. And if you have no income, you have some benefit. And then as your income increases, that benefit is reduced. And that kind of a structure leads to a clear, unambiguous disincentive to work. You get the largest benefit if you're not working. If you work, you're essentially facing another tax rate. Interestingly, the food stamp program started with a relatively modest phase-out rate. So the old welfare program, AFDC, had a 100% tax rate. You earn $1, you get $1 left in government benefits. At the very lowest, the tax rate was 2/3. You earn $1, your benefit goes down by 66 cents. The food stamp program has a 20% phase-out rate, and what that means is that it, in essence, captures more of the working poor, not just the non-working poor, because it's got a lower phase-out and more muted work disincentive effects. But it's a basic welfare program. The Earned Income Tax Credit is our main in-work assistance program. So you need to have earnings to get the Earned Income Tax Credit. And like the Working Family Tax Credit in the UK, and I have a slide later on that shows a comparison among many OECD countries, it's essentially an earnings subsidy that's eventually phased out. And the whole principle of the EITC is to transfer resources to low-income working families whilst promoting work. And as was mentioned in the introduction, it's been shown to be extremely effective social policy for increasing the employment of single mothers. Among married couples, which represent about 1/3 of the EITC recipients, the incentives are more complicated, and is certainly less clear that it changes employment very much as a whole. But it's been very important for increasing the employment rate, aiding the transformation from out of work to in work among more low-educated single mothers in the United States. To sort of round things out, we've got the standard social insurance program of unemployment benefits, where you need to become eligible for these benefits through having work history, and when you lose your job, you get some replacement of your earnings for a fixed amount of time. And then I'm not going to talk about it much at all, but also sort of in the background here is the steady growth, which is being seen really across Europe, as well as in the United States. The steady growth of disability benefits is really sort of pre-retirement. In our case, we have a separate social insurance and public assistance program. So that's sort of the patchwork of programs that I want to talk about. I think I pretty much already said all this, actually. The motivation here is that, essentially the out-of-work safety net was shrunk and the in-work safety net grew. And I think I probably don't need to say anything more here. But let me show you, this is sort of what happened to AFDC. So this is just total number of families on the program. It's not even adjusted for dividing by the population to have it to be the rate. But it nonetheless shows very dramatically that, in around 1996 when the program was reformed, which is essentially, it didn't get rid of the program, but we essentially created a time-limited version of the original program that said you can, over your lifetime, receive a maximum of 5 years worth of benefits. And while you're receiving benefits, you need to go through a lot of effort to show that you're looking for work, and you need to show up for classes to prepare you for that, and if you don't show up, you can get sanctioned. And many states actually reduced the lifetime limit to 2 years. So it really restricted what was available. And what you saw is that there's historic decline in the number of families that were receiving this program, and it's really just continued to go down. So it's really very small now. At the same time, there's the rise of the Earned Income Tax Credit, both through its introduction and expansion through tax expansions, as well as the increase due to additional families taking advantage of the program. And I've just sort of demarcated the various points in time where the program was expanded. And I'm not going to talk much about the details of any of that, but suffice it to say, and I'll show you in another graph, when I put all these programs on the same graph, you can sort of see the relative importance of one versus the other. So, stepping back a little bit from the few programs that I just sort of went into depth on, this is a calculation from the most recent year of data on the new supplemental poverty measure in the US to ask how many children are kept above poverty due to, and here's basically the range of programs that some I mentioned, some I didn't mention. And this is a static calculation. And what that means is that you just take a survey of households and you take those that have, for example, their earned income tax credit, and you zero that income source out and you recalculate poverty, assuming no behavioral response, hence the term static. So it's a very simple sort of accounting relationship that basically says, this is children, that the EITC, their earned income tax credit, is the biggest anti-poverty program in the United States. And SNAP, which is just another word for food stamps, is the second biggest. So that's why I'm focusing on those programs. If you look at all persons in the entire United States, not just children, what you see, and this surprises a lot of people, is that the biggest anti-poverty program in the United States as a whole is actually Social Security, which is a program that goes to the elderly. So what's interesting about that is that, of course, poverty is a family concept, and we add the income of everybody in the family, and even when you look only at children, you see Social Security sort of kicking in. The point is simply that Social Security is so important for the elderly that when you put all persons together, it swamps everything else. So that just gives you a sense of how important these programs are relative to one another, and I'm not sure why I have it later in my talk, but I'll be just specific about how we measure poverty, because in the US we measure poverty as an absolute concept, whereas in most countries it's measured as a relative concept, and there'll be a quick slide on that later. So that's the discussion of the changing policy setting leading up to the Great Recession. What about in the Great Recession? Well, there was an important stimulus package, and I've summarized just a few of the critical features of the stimulus package that are most relevant for the population that I'm talking about today. And we're really the most stimulative of the stimulus package. The first was this extension of unemployment benefits, as I mentioned in my introduction, up to as high as 99 weeks, 2 years of unemployment benefits. Secondly was increasing the amount of unemployment benefits and also of food stamp benefits per week or per month for those that are receiving benefits, just increase those temporarily and slightly. Also increasing the EITC for, in particular, they targeted families with 3 or more children and gave them a more generous earned income tax credit. And then finally, there was a sort of new, again, all these are temporary measures, a new tax credit that provided up to $400 of tax credit back for households, for workers actually. That's per worker, not per household. So this just gives you, this is from a paper by Jesse Rothstein, Andres Mueller, and Til van Wachter, that just shows you over time the changes in, I'll just point out here the dashed line, which is the maximum number of weeks if you're a worker who entered unemployment at these particular dates. And this is where, and all the jaggedness to this dashed line come from legislated changes that Congress and the President made throughout this time period. And so this just sort of illustrates this 99 weeks. And in this paper, they do some really interesting stuff that uses these weird events where basically it's because Congress doesn't take action, something lapses, and then some time passes, and then they get their act together, and they pass something, and you get these kind of weird quirkiness that if you're a worker who happens to become unemployed in one interval, you might have access to a very different social safety net in terms of how many weeks you get unemployment that if you enter unemployment in another interval. It's really interesting and important work. So this is sort of putting it all together and looking again back to 1980. And what I've done here is in plotting just these 4 key programs, and just plotting how much we're spending, real expenditures per capita, back to 1980. And what I want to just draw your attention to is a couple of things. You can clearly see in this 90s period the decline of welfare, that's the solid blue line, and then the rise of the Earned Income Tax Credit. And then the dashed line, which is the food stamp program, and I should say that these gray areas are the official recessionary periods, at least annualized versions of them. And what you can see is really the growth of food stamps in the Great Recession. At one point, the Republicans were calling Barack Obama the food stamps president, which was meant to be negative, but I guess that's up to you. And then the black solid line just shows you the, of course, not at all surprisingly, incredible cyclical nature of unemployment benefits, as we would expect it to be. And the point of putting these all on here is to just show you the relative magnitude of how much we're spending on these programs. Obviously, unemployment is by far the biggest. It's not targeted to low-income population. Everybody's eligible as long as you have the work history for it. So it's certainly the most expensive program among these, at least in times where there's a lot of unemployment. Okay, so how did the safety net respond? So we wanted to essentially say, okay, so we had this Great Recession. We certainly would have expected that unemployment, food stamps, and the sort of welfare safety net should respond to increases in need through the unemployment rate going up. And we wanted to ask the question whether or not the response that we saw, that I just sort of showed you, at least in a aggregate nature on this graph, was what we would have expected based on the historical relationship. And through this, a sort of indirect analysis of what all these changes to the social safety net led up to, what they amounted to in the end. So we essentially take this comparative approach, and we again use this analysis where we use variation across states and over time in order to identify the effect of cycles. And then look at the effects on, what I'm going to first show you is how responsive is a social safety net and how does that compare over time. And then I'll talk about poverty after that. So just to give you some idea about the variation across states and over time, this just shows you for the 2007 to 2009 period, the striking increase in unemployment in the United States. These are the states, I live in California, it was one of the highest states most affected in the Great Recession. In part, these were the states that had the big housing bubble and the crash from the housing bubble. So Nevada, Florida, and California saw the highest increases in unemployment rate over this period. But in contrast, North Dakota is a very small state that, how many people in this room have ever even heard of North Dakota? It's really small. It's in the center, north of the United States. And they're having this gas boom through, a lot of it is through fracking and other things. And so even in the presence of all of this, there's like 5 people who live there, but there wasn't much increase in unemployment. And if I'd shown you more states down here, it's not just this silly story of just these few states, but there's there's just incredible variation across the United States. And there's a lot of debate about, well, what creates that variation? Is it the sectors, the industrial structure, other things? But nonetheless, there's a lot of variation in terms of the recession. And so with that analysis, and with the discussion that I just had with you about what changed both in the period leading up to the Great Recession and during the Great Recession, what would we expect to find in a comparison of the Great Recession to the early 1980s period? Well, this is what I expected. With the decline of welfare and the rise of the EITC, my assumption is there's less protection in the Great Recession than there used to be because of the bottom really fell out. And one of the things that I want to end my talk with is, as much as the Earned Income Tax Credit is a fabulous and important part of the social safety net in the United States and many countries, it's really not very well suited to a situation when there isn't work. And I want to sort of quantify that as one of my comments at the end of the talk. But the sum total is, my prior is we would expect less protection at the bottom anyways because of the reform of welfare and the expansion of the replacement of it within work benefits. However, the sort of expansions of unemployment insurance and food stamps suggest that there might be more protection going on through those programs. So essentially, this graph summarizes some regression results on exactly those questions. So each one of the panels here gives you different programs, and each one of the dots here come from a state panel regression model where we regress dollars, or in this case it's the number of participants per capita in the welfare program, here AFDC TANF, at the state by year level. And we regress that on an unemployment rate at the state by year level, interacted with dummies for different time periods. And essentially what this gives you, what I'm summarizing here and dropping everything else from the regression just to keep your eyes on what I want you to pay attention to, the red dot and its confidence interval tells you the response of the AFDC TANF caseload to a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate in the 1980s decade. And in contrast, the red dot gives you the same estimate for the Great Recession period. And what I've dropped out of here is the middle period. I'm just not showing you that, just to keep your eyes focused on this. And then we do the same thing for food stamps, unemployment insurance, and the Earned Income Tax Credit. And we did a lot of other things, but this is what I want to focus on. And so there are several things that you can see here. But first, just so everybody's on board with what these magnitudes mean, as I've indicated here, this red dot, the highest one of them all, says that a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate in a state by year area is associated with an 18% increase in the number of people per capita participating in unemployment insurance during the Great Recession. And by comparison, in the early 1980s period, that was lower. So by looking across this, you can see a couple of things. One, you can see how the responsiveness to the cycle varies across these programs. Maybe not surprisingly, it's highest for UI. That's precisely what it's structured to do. It's lower for the rest of the safety net. It's basically zero for the Earned Income Tax Credit. The red line here is, of course, the zero line, and the confidence intervals span that for the EITC. And I'm going to come back to that at the end and not talk much more about the EITC after this slide. But what you can also see is that while the AFDC program wasn't hugely cyclical in the early 1980s, and when I say cyclical, I mean counter-cyclical. That is, when unemployment goes up, utilization of this safety net program goes up. And what we see now is basically absolutely nothing in the Great Recession. So the AFDC program is both, TANF now, is both low in terms of the number of people participating in it, but also not reacting to need. It's not increasing anywhere where there's greater need. So it's just not functioning in this dimension of a kind of a job loss safety net. You can also see that, if anything, the food stamp program has become slightly more cyclical, although we usually can't reject that those two things are the same. And you can see that the UI program, our UI benefits, are also becoming more cyclical. That is, providing more protection for a kind of unit increase in unemployment. And so that's sort of the takeaway from the analysis of what's happened to the social safety net. And let me just illustrate the kind of important finding about AFDC-TANF one more way besides just pointing to those summary graphs. What I have here is just a scatter plot, which is essentially showing you the same thing as the regressions, although focusing in on a given time period. So the x-axis on both sides here is the change in the unemployment rate. Each observation here is a state. And on the left-hand side, we've got the period 2007 to 2009, and the x-axis is the state's change in the unemployment rate. So, like, this is California, a bigger bubble, bigger state. So I know California both had a big unemployment rate, they're the biggest state, so it must be this one. And North Dakota is probably like this one. Small state, small increase in unemployment. But the y-axis here is the percent change in the AFDC-TANF caseload per capita. And what you can see here is that, well, first of all, here's the zero line. I didn't put it on here, but here it is. Many states' AFDC-TANF programs were actually decreasing over this time period. But to me, more importantly, there's no systematic pattern here of an increase in support in areas that had greater need, that is, higher unemployment increases. Whereas, just by way of comparison, in the early 1980s recession, it's not a super steep relationship. I mean, the regression, this is basically the slope of this is, like the regression estimates that I showed you, but it certainly is more reacting to need than it is in the Great Recession. So it's just in a way to sort of visually see that. Food stamps, I can show you this time I remembered to put the zero line in. This now this is the same thing as I had on the left-hand side in the last slide. It's the reaction of cash welfare. And on the right-hand side is what food stamps in the same time period was doing. So you can just sort of visually see that the expansion of the food stamp safety net was going up by more in areas where there was greater need, which seems sort of obvious, and to me is sort of a definition of what you want a safety net to be doing. And the point is, this is sort of evidence that this cash safety net through TANF is just not functioning in that way anymore. So then now I want to go on to, I think I said all of this. Now what I want to go on to is to talk about poverty and the sort of sum total of all these changes in the safety net and how it shows up for the well-being of disadvantaged families. So a bit of a primer here, because the United States does things differently than pretty much everybody else in this context. The United States defines poverty as an absolute measure. Whereas in most European contexts, this must be true in Italy, poverty is relative. So something like 30% of median income, that's the poverty line. And if your income is below that, you're poor. If your income is above that, you're not poor. An interesting thing to an American in thinking about that is if the entire income distribution shifted up, poverty would be unchanged, which to me seems odd because I've grown up in a setting where we define poverty as sort of some absolute disadvantage, that the minimum amount of income you need to have an adequate, and that's a little bit difficult to define what adequate means, but an adequate standard of living. And that is essentially defined by things about housing and price of food and things of that sort. To give you an idea of what that poverty line is, for 2013, the most recent year of data, if you're 2 parents and 2 children, the poverty line is a little under $24,000. Right? So that would be something like 18,000 euro or something like that for 4 people. So bottom line, it's really low. It's not very high. By comparison, median income in the United States in 2013 was $51,000, just to give you some kind of comparison. So that's how poverty is measured in the United States. And of course, not surprisingly, in the Great Recession, we saw an increase in poverty. And let me just say one more thing I forgot to say on this slide, but you might have read. Official poverty in the United States is pre-tax, cash-only poverty. That's what resources are officially counted to define poverty. Everybody agrees this is very out of date, as a huge amount of assistance is provided in kind, like food stamps, and through the tax system, the Earned Income Tax Credit. So there's a new poverty measure called the supplemental poverty measure, which is not official, but is widely used. And essentially what I'm going to be doing in the work that follows is essentially to do not exactly the supplemental poverty measure for technical reasons I don't want to go into, but something very similar to it. So when I measure poverty here, it's always a household concept. That's true for official and the supplemental poverty. But I add up all the income sources that I see in the data, including in-kind sources like food stamps and housing benefits, and I also incorporate the tax system. So it's a kind of after-tax, after-transfer poverty measure. If I use that and look at the Great Recession, the black line is just repeating the unemployment rate that we've already seen, but focusing in on the 2007 to 2012 period. And then the blue bars is what's happening to overall poverty over that period. And not surprisingly, and we'd certainly see this in the historical setting, is that in recessions, poverty goes up. That's kind of, shouldn't be surprising. But what we then go on to do is to ask, well, how did poverty change compared to what we would have expected from the historical setting, mimicking the same thing that I talked about just prior about the social safety net. To give you a little bit of an idea of what's happening with after-tax and transfer income poverty, what I've got here is each state in the United States, and they're sorted by the change in the after-tax and transfer income poverty measure in the Great Recession period. And the blue bar gives you that, and just by way of comparison, the open circle gives you the change in poverty that would have occurred if we just ignored all sources of government transfers and tax assistance. And the point of this is to simply show you that the blue bars are much more compressed than the no government world of the open circles. So it's just to kind of mechanically showing you the importance that there is a safety net and it's doing something. You can also see it, I think, in a more meaningful way by showing you a scatter plot like I did before, but I didn't weight the circles in this case, just forgot to do that. The x-axis is the same, the change in the unemployment rate state by state. And now, again, over sort of this Great Recession period, we have to average more years in order to get enough power on the poverty measures. That's why the years are different. But what you can see is these black dots are the relationship between pre-government income poverty and the unemployment rate at the state-by-state level. And the open blue dots are post-government after-tax and transfer income poverty compared to the change in the employment rate at the state level. And what you can see is not only that the blue dots lie below the red dots, government programs bring down poverty, but importantly, it brings down the slope of the relationship between the amount of the labor demand shock and the change in poverty rates. And then we can do that in a regression setting and basically find something quite similar. And so we do that, and then we do the comparison across the Great Recession to the early 1980s recession, just like I showed you before. So again, each one of these are a different set of regressions, and what we've done is look at the reaction at different points in the income distribution. So what I was just showing you was 100% of poverty, so the share of people with incomes below 100% of poverty. But I can do the same thing for what we term extreme poverty, which is income below 50% poverty, or I can also show it to you for income below 200% of poverty. So what to learn from this analysis is, I'm an optimist. I'm as we say, a glass half full person for the most part. So I'm going to start with the good news. The good news is that 100% of poverty, the fraction of people below 100% of poverty, and its reaction to the Great Recession is lower than it was in the early 1980s recession. So a given 1 percentage point increase in unemployment leads to less increase in 100% poverty for those below 100% of poverty in the Great Recession than the early 1980s recession, and that's good, in my opinion. And in trying to connect the dots between the work that I showed you earlier and this, it seems that can be kind of tied to the expansion of food stamps and maybe to some degree also the unemployment insurance that took place in the Great Recession. The bad news is that extreme poverty, incomes below 50% of poverty, has become more volatile, more countercyclical. So in bad times, extreme poverty has gone up by more than it did in the early 1980s recession, and that is very easily connected to the elimination of the cash safety net program through welfare reform. And another way to see that is to compare the extreme poverty rates, which are low, for both the blue period is the 1980 recession and the red period, the Great Recession, and then one by one take away each source of income and recalculate poverty and see by how much it's gone up. And the point of this is to show that, in the early 1980s recession, eliminating AFDC income, simulating the elimination of the safety net, really increased the poverty rate, whereas it did very little in the Great Recession. So it's just another way of pointing out the fall of protection through a cash safety net. So with that, I just want to end. Those are sort of the facts and the evidence from the series of studies that I've been doing on this issue. And what I want to do is to sort of pull that together and give my thoughts on where I see the successes or holes in the safety net going forward, which probably most of you have already gathered by what I've showed you so far, but it's a summary if nothing else. The most important one, I think the one that's the most robust that we find looking in many different ways, is that there's not much of a safety net for extreme poverty in the United States right now. If you can't get assistance when you lose your job through unemployment insurance, or if you're not able to meet the definition of disability, there's just not much there. And the consequence is that extreme poverty is more impacted in the recession than we would have expected. Number two, a large and targeted stimulus can make a difference. Now, I haven't shown you really direct evidence on that, but the indirect evidence is that these expansions of especially unemployment and food stamps seem to be leading to more protection than we would have expected in the absence of those things. Number three, and this is the one I just want to spend a few minutes on before concluding, and it's a little bit off topic, but something I just think it's important to point out as countries are continuing to develop this in-work safety net program as a sort of substitute for the out-of-work safety net program, is that while the Earned Income Tax Credit does many excellent things, it's certainly the case that voters in the United States want to redistribute income while encouraging work. That is certainly the preferences of the median voter, and the EITC does a very good job of doing that. But what it's not very well suited to do is to provide protection in a situation when you don't have work. And furthermore, it's not replacing income that's lost from earnings. And one just small I was about to transition into the next slide, and I forgot that I put this in here. This is just a comparison of the different OECD countries and their provision of in-work safety net programs. So let me just walk you through this. This is just showing you that a lot of countries have these programs in place. And this is from an OECD publication that kind of does a nice job of summarizing them in several graphs, and I've just included one here. The way to read this is the y-axis here is the percent of average wages. And the range of the line tells you how far up and down the average wage distribution does this in-work credit provide support. The white bar area tells you what range of earnings is someone eligible for the maximum benefit in the in-work credit, called the EITC in the US. And they're compared across sort of two different sets of countries. One, which are termed more targeted credits, are countries where the credits are phased out at a relatively high rate. And so they don't extend throughout the income distribution. There's a cap here to how far you're eligible for. And the countries on the right provide more universal credits, although some at higher generosity levels than others. And so that's just a way of sort of summarizing the fact that a lot of countries are providing these programs, and it's really the targeted programs that provide the sort of are being thought of as more replacement for out-of-work benefit programs that's relevant for the point that I want to make. So let me show you the example of the EITC within the kind of picture that I've been showing you. So this is showing, again, the state scatter plot. And what I've done is, with the administrative EITC data, I can split it up between, on the left, are single women, primarily single, although men and women with children who participate in the credit, and on the right, married couples. And what you can see is, because the EITC is targeted and based on family income, for the most part, if a single earner family experiences a labor market shock, they're going to either exit the labor market and not have the EITC at all, or maybe move down the EITC schedule. On net, what you get is a very weak pro-cyclical relationship. And that's what you see on the left-hand side. So higher unemployment rate shock, lower increase in the credit. So it's more pro-cyclical, which makes sense. You need work, you need earnings to get the credit. So when work is more abundant, the utilization of the credit is higher. Interestingly, though, for married couples, because it's a targeted program and such a large share of the population of married couples have earnings beyond the EITC range, so going back to this graph, beyond the range of the EITC here, because there's so many families that have income beyond that range, when a married couple gets hit with a shock, there's some non-trivial share who earn their way into the EITC credit range. So interestingly, something I hadn't given a lot of thought to before I did this work, the EITC does provide traditional cyclical income protection for married couples because of that feature of the credit and the income distribution for married couples. But for the most part, overall, it's not a program that's particularly well suited to providing job loss type income protection, which is fine. No one program can do all things, but it's sort of been left standing as something that one program can do all things, and that's why I think it's important to bring attention to that. So I guess my last point was, in wanting to end in a positive note, as I'm prone to want to do, is to just remind everybody that the government programs can do much to mediate the shock of a downturn. And there's a sort of pretty straight relationship between providing more of that and the impacts for what's happening in the income distribution and changes in poverty in economic cycles. So with that, I will stop here. Sit down, sure.
Thank you very much to Hilary for the great presentation, to the organizer for asking me to discuss the papers. So actually this presentation is based on a lot of work, as you have seen. There are at least 4 or 5 papers. So when I saw this, I said, oh my God.
What have you said yes to?
But in the end, I have to say honestly, I really enjoyed this. Because, I mean, you can see it's really kind of top-notch research applied to very, very advanced stuff. And, I mean, many cases you see just one of these two things. I mean, either sound empirical methodologies or interesting topics, but when you find some papers that can combine both, I think it's very, it's just great. And even the level of institutional detail that you find in the paper and that you just saw in the presentation, I mean, it's quite unusual for a paper in economics. So in this discussion, I'm just going to give you a a brief summary of my take-home from Hilary's presentation. So what I like the most, but of course there are many things, I can focus on all of them, but I just want to highlight 3 points. So the first contribution, I think, is a very careful analysis of the impact of the Great Recession on unemployment by group. And in this respect, the main results are that there is a stronger impact of the Great Recession on the unemployment of black males in the US, low-skilled workers, and the youth. Although I have something to say about this age effect, especially in comparison to the case of Italy and European countries. The second main contribution is a very careful explanation and discussion of how the safety net works in the US now, and which were the main changes that were implemented in 1996. So, as Hilary mentioned before, basically it was a transition from out of work to in-work assistance, and this provided, of course, better incentives, like high-power incentives to labor market participation and employment during expansionary periods, but of course raises the question of what's going to happen when there is no work. I mean, when labor demand is very weak, like now, and this can create holes in the safety net during the Great Recession. And we also saw there was some adjustment, some fine-tuning of the safety net in the last few years to amend this kind of holes. In particular, there was an extension of unemployment benefits and of the food stamp program. So the bottom line, I mean, the last contribution of the analysis, what is the impact of the Great Recession on poverty, and especially what's the differential impact relative to previous recessions. And in this respect, I think the conclusion is that actually there was a stronger increase in extreme poverty, possibly because of this first part of the reforms that, I mean, basically shifted from out of work to in-work assistance. But at the same time, there was a weaker increase in poverty. So a bigger increase in extreme poverty, but a weaker increase in poverty, which is the good news. So I reversed the order because I'm typically a very pessimistic. So I see the half empty glass. Okay, let me go to the outline of this discussion. As I say, I mean, the papers and the presentations, they were very complete. I mean, honestly, I don't have much to say about this. I mean, all these papers are already published in very good journals. They were published relatively quickly, which is a sign of the quality also of the work. So, I mean, rather than picking on, okay, I would have had this fixed effect or something like this, which is, I think, not very useful for anybody. I mean, the outline of my discussion is going to be mostly a comparison about what we just saw and what's the evidence for Italy and for Europe. Okay, so here we have a careful account of the experience in the US. I'm going to give you a less careful account of what happens in Europe, first of all, because I don't have like the skills and the expertise to go through all these details, and also because I'm going to deal with aggregate data across countries for which there are a lot of issues of comparability. So most of the descriptions that you will see about the safety net in Europe or in Italy is kind of a joke relative to the description of the safety net that we just saw for the US. But I mean, let's just start from this for the moment. And so I'm going to focus on differential impacts by age, on the impact of the Great Recession on poverty, and on the working on the safety net across this country. So more or less the same issues covered for the US. I'm going to make a comparison with Europe. So this is again the only thing that I have to say about basically the analysis of Hilary. So this was one of the first graphs. So here you have the differential impact of unemployment by age. And she showed this graph, and you see there's actually a greater increase in the unemployment of young people for a 1 percentage point increase in the overall unemployment. And so, I mean, in the discussion, in the paper, she points at an age effect. I mean, actually, if you look at the range, I mean, this age effect stops basically at the age of 25, okay? So, I mean, people that are going to suffer from this disproportionate increase in unemployment, most of these people are going to be either college dropout or even high school dropout. So I'm not really sure that you can distinguish between an age effect or an education effect here. But this was more of an excuse for showing you what I think it's an age effect. So an age effect is what we see in Italy. So here I basically replicated the same analysis using the OECD labor force statistic, which is an harmonized data set. You don't have the exact age of the worker, but you have age categories which are pretty well defined. And so I replicated the analysis of Hilary, and I find exactly the same. Actually, I find a stronger increase also at later ages, which corroborates your interpretation. It's actually a true age effect, because at this age, the effect of college dropouts and high school dropouts should vanish away. But here the most important thing of this graph is the comparison with what happens in Italy. I mean, the increase in the unemployment, in the differential unemployment of young people for a 1 percentage point increase in overall unemployment is much greater in Italy. It persists until people are like 40, okay? So we are very generous in the definition of young people in Italy. It stands until 40 years old people, so I qualify myself as a young in Italy. And I mean, if you consider young people like those until 40 years of age, I mean, the whole burden of the adjustment in the labor market is just going to be borne by these people. So I replicated again the analysis on 12 countries, because, even more, 16 countries, sorry. So this is again the same data set, the OECD LFS, and I grouped these countries into 4 main groups. So the first one is Anglo-Saxon countries, so there is the US together with UK, Australia and Canada. Here is continental Europe, so Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands. I was not really sure where to put France, but don't know if they are happier to be considered together with the Germans in this period or with Southern Europe. But anyway, I think they are more similar in many respects to Germany than to Southern Europe, which is Italy with Portugal, Spain and Greece. And in the last group we are the Scandinavian countries. So what you see from this graph is that this age gradient in the differential impact of the Great Recession and unemployment is mostly pronounced for Southern Europe. We already saw this from Italy, but we have a similar pattern in Portugal, Spain, and so on. And also in Scandinavian countries. I mean, Scandinavian countries and Southern European countries are basically the opposite in all respects, but they're labor market institutions. So in countries in both this group, you had very rigid labor markets in the 80s, and then there were reforms, but all the reforms in both groups of countries, they were concentrated on the entrance in the labor market. Okay, so basically you were keeping a lot of employment protection for the older workers, and you were just imposing more flexibility on the new entrants. And of course this effect accumulated over time, and so basically we are with a population of workers until 40 years of age that go from a short-term contract to another short-term contract, and you have workers, let's say, older than 40 years of age that are much more protected. Okay, so it's not surprising in both these groups of countries you see this disproportionate adjustment of that's just borne by younger workers. Okay, so this is the main effect of what is called the dualism of the labor markets in both groups of countries. Okay, this dualism in the fact that you have different institutions for different categories of workers defined by age. And of course you have a gradient effect also in the US, in the Anglo-Saxon countries, but it's much less pronounced, and there's basically almost nothing in continental Europe. Okay, so in continental Europe this line is pretty much flat, which means that everybody is going to bear quite a proportional share of the adjustment. So of course this dualism is not just bad because it increases unemployment when there is a recession, but also because, I mean, these people, they were already starting from a higher unemployment rate, okay? Because here, if you look at Southern Europe, people between 15 years of age and 34, they start already in 2001 with an unemployment rate of 15%, which then remains pretty stable. There's a slight reduction, and then it skyrockets during the crisis. Okay, so now here I stop at 2013. It was already 30%. Now in Italy, juvenile unemployment is about 43%. So in the Scandinavian countries, the situation is not so dramatic, but you see again this dualism. To be honest, you find something very similar also in Anglo-Saxon countries. So the reaction to the crisis was not so disproportionately on the young people in Anglo-Saxon countries, but in this country you see still a much higher unemployment rate for the young. Where you don't really see anything is in continental Europe. Okay, so in continental Europe, it seems that basically the unemployment rate is more or less the same by age category, and also the reaction to the crisis is more or less the same. So, of course, we be worried when we think about poverty, about what happened to these young people during the Great Recession. The effect of the recession on poverty through the unemployment rate is going to be mediated, of course, by the safety net, which was the main argument, one main topic of the presentation. And so here is just, again, a very simple view of social expenditure across OECD countries. And here, again, I distinguish between these 4 groups of countries, so the Anglo-Saxons, continental Europe, Southern Europe, and Scandinavia. Here you don't see much of a difference, actually, in terms of... Actually, the main difference is that there is more social expenditure as a percentage of the GDP in Europe rather than in the US or in other Anglo-Saxon countries. We all know this. But in terms of composition, in all these groups of countries, most of the resources they are devoted to pension, so to people that are already retired from the labor market, and to health, which is also going to benefit especially older people, and for a good reason. It's not that there's nothing wrong with this. What's a bit wrong is that the amount of resources devoted to active labor market policies or unemployment benefits is pretty low. Again, with no distinction by the group of countries. It's just a very minor fraction of the total social expenditure. So you might say, okay, this was the picture in 2005 for the recession, but for sure these people during the recession, they basically increased unemployment benefits like we saw in the US and so on. Well, not really much. So this is the exchange between 2005 and 2009. Unfortunately, there are no data provided by the OECD for later than 2009. And the red bar is the increase in terms of percentage points of GDP in pensions, in pension expenditure. And the blue bar is the increase in unemployment plus active labor market programs. So you see, actually, in the US, there was quite an increase, like we saw before in the presentation. There was an even greater increase in Ireland and in Spain. This was basically an automatic reaction of unemployment benefits to the big increase in unemployment in Spain. But for the other countries, you don't see much. Actually, we are continuing to spending more and actually more and more on pensions than on unemployment benefits or labor market programs, even during the recession. Of course, part of this is just a long-run trend, which depends automatically on the fact that populations are aging and so on. But still, you may find it, or at least I find it disturbing, that even during this period, you don't find a way to shift resources to our people that are still in the labor market and should be active in the labor market. So now let me focus on unemployment benefits. So, okay, unemployment benefits, they are just a small fraction, but let's try to see if they are spent well, which means they are spent on people that are actually losing the job and so on. So here in this graph, I have again the same age categories, and the green line is the fraction of people unemployed by age in the year 2012 in different countries. And the red line is the amount of unemployment benefits per capita spent by age category. Okay? So what you see immediately from this graph is that in Austria and in Germany, basically the age profile of unemployment benefits matches pretty well the age profile of unemployment in 2012. Which already in Germany we saw this. There's not such a strong age gradient. Actually, there is an age gradient, but in the opposite direction of Southern Europe. So actually, it's mostly the older workers that are unemployed, and these people, they are more protected in the sense they get more unemployment benefits. In Austria, it's overall pretty flat, but there is a good match between unemployment benefits and unemployment rates. Here, when you go to Italy, Greece, Portugal, and Spain, so the Southern Europe, here you see really the hole, we were mentioning holes in the safety net. The big hole here is that most of the unemployed people are the younger workers in all these countries, and most of the unemployment benefits they are spent on older workers or workers that are close to retirement. So this is the second important aspect of dualism. It's not just that younger workers, they have short-term contracts, so they are at higher risk of being fired when there is a recession. The other thing is that if you are on a short-term contract, in most cases you don't have any access to unemployment benefits in case you lose your job. So it's more likely that you lose your job, and moreover, it's less likely that you get unemployment benefits. Okay? And you see, Sweden is the only Scandinavian countries for which I had this data. These are computed, by the way, based on the USIC microdata, and you see a similar whole. I mean, now the situation in Sweden is not as severe as Southern Europe, but you see exactly the same. I mean, most of unemployment is concentrated on younger workers, but most of the protection goes to older workers, which were already more protected to start with in terms of higher unemployment protection. So, very last graph. So unemployment benefits, of course, is just part of all the social transfers. So with the EU SIC data, it could do another thing. So they provide a measure of disposable income before and after transfers. Of course, excluding, I exclude here social security transfers, because these are pretty, these are trivially concentrated on people that are outside, that should be here. Okay, but for all the other transfers, what I did was basically to compute the amount of transfers per capita received by age category as a difference between the disposable income before and after transfers. Okay, so here I have continental Europe before the Great Recession and continental Europe after the Great Recession, and here I have continental Europe, Southern Europe before the Great Recession and after the Great Recession. So you see many things from this graph. First thing is that you have more social transfers, so more social expenditure on, in continental Europe. Okay, so families get more of this transfer. So again, this is unemployment benefit and all the rest. So disability benefits, sickness leave, maternity leave, and all the possible transfers except for social security. Okay, so these people in Germany and France and Belgium, they get more of this, and moreover, you see that again the age profile is pretty flat. Okay? The other interesting thing is that when it comes to increase these transfers during the Great Recessions, what they do, they increase the transfers especially for people that are below 40 years of age. So actually here you have two peaks. One is between the age category between 35 and 39, and another one is between 29 and 25 and 29. Okay? And basically they achieve this expansion in social transfer here, but basically redistributing a bit of these social transfers that were allocated to all the age categories. Okay, this point here. When you go to Southern Europe, basically you have a clear increasing age gradient, which means you give more again to older workers, and then you try to increase social expenditure during the recession, in the aftermath of the recession, but it's like a parallel shift. I mean, you don't try this reallocation from people that are close to retirement or that, again, they were more protected before the crisis to younger people that suffer most of the increase in unemployment, but it's just a parallel shift. So for any euros you were giving before, you just give a bit more. And last thing I forgot, so I said it was the last graph, it's not, so this is just the bottom line, okay? So what's the implication in terms of poverty? Well, very clearly, I mean, you have these young people with less protection, they suffer most of the increase in unemployment, they get less of social expenditure, so very naturally this brings a large increase in inequality, in poverty. So you could call this like the reversal of misfortunes, okay? So this is absolute poverty in Italy. By the way, Italy is one of these countries in which we have absolute poverty, but it's true that it's a pretty recent introduction, so since 2005. Before we just had relative poverty. But here is the fraction of people in absolute poverty above 65 years of age. Actually, before the crisis, there were more poor people among the older people than among younger age categories. But what happens is that this line remains basically flat. Okay, they don't suffer any increase in poverty during the Great Recession, and instead what happens is that the young people, like people under 35 years of age, they start from a lower poverty rate, which is about 4%, but this doubles during the crisis. And the same, of course, for all the other age categories that are actually in the labor market. There is again, quite a clear age profile. So this is the same picture for Europe. Again, you find the same thing that you find in Italy for Southern Europe, while you don't find this in continental Europe. So let me just skip on this. So I think the bottom line is that this dualism of the labor market in Southern Europe, to a lesser extent in Scandinavian countries, this is what creates systematic holes in the safety nets of many of these countries, and it's a combined effect of lower employment protection and also lesser access to transfers in case you lose your job. And I mean, we should start, I think, wondering about what are the long-term effects on this of these big holes in the safety nets in the future decades in terms of health and family formation and fertility. And I think this is an interesting area of current research. So thank you.
Well, we had a great lecture, and then an analysis of the, above all, of the age profile of poverty in Europe, which is extremely interesting because also allows for comparison between the US, the way in which the US welfare state operated, and the European. So I'm sure there are questions here. We don't have that much time, but we can take a few questions. So I have my own questions too, but I don't want to impose mine. Yes, Katya.
I was wondering, so at least in, for example, in developing countries where you have very little of these kind of formal safety nets, right? One kind of way to ensure would be basically within a larger extended family, right, or even between households. Can you give us an estimate of how important you think these effects are in the US, so that, you know, maybe, I don't know, maybe these sort of single households which are, you know, most vulnerable, maybe they have received transfers, you know, within the extended family, or maybe they have kind of also very little insurance in this way. I don't know what is your...
Yeah, that's a great question, and it clearly is something that shows up in the U.S. context. Our data is not so good on transfers when household members are not co-residing, so I don't think I have much to say about that. But I think the main dimension that this can take place is changes in household formation. And I actually have a small piece that I'm doing right now that I have some preliminary results on that looks at to what extent can we observe, again, a differential change in the notion of like doubling, what's called doubling up in the United States. So two households living together, or young adults living longer at home. And the interest, to actually somewhat to my extent, but surprise, maybe because I'm the mother of a 20-year-old, and so the conversation with everybody I know is, our children, of course, are going to come home when they graduate college, and we weren't really expecting that, and that's somewhat of a new phenomenon in the United States. I expected that we would see a greater reaction of these measures of living arrangements in the Great Recession. And again, the response is pretty much the same as what we've seen in prior recessions. The incidence of doubling up goes up. The incidence of young adults living with their parents increases. The size of the number of people living together goes up, but it all seems to be going up sort of in lockstep with historical experience. So yes, that takes place, and how much people are getting help in financial forms is just something we don't have good enough data to answer. So I think your intuition is exactly right. That's not only a developing country context reaction.
Can we attribute the fact that elder people get less protected by safety net, for instance, in response to European context, to culture, since elder people tend to work longer in the US than in Europe?
Right. I mean, there's an awful lot of really good comparative work that tries to take advantage of the fact that the institutions around pensions and when you're eligible for pensions and how that varies across states across countries in order to try to understand how this influences this important move from the labor market to out of the labor market. And I think the work shows pretty conclusively that, the countries that provide more opportunities for early retirement. So the U.S. originally, you could retire as early as 62 with Social Security at a somewhat reduced rate, and that's slowly increasing, that you see more, an earlier retirement age in those contexts. So I think there's a very well-documented, strong reaction to the incentives around retirement through the public pension system. The private pension system is a bit more complicated and a little harder to get a handle on, but I think it's pretty clear that people respond to financial incentives at retirement. It's obviously not the only part of the story, but is an important part of the story.
I was wondering what the reason is for the fact that young black males are the most impacted. Is that because of the industrial sectors they work in? Is it because they have less education on average? Is it their high incarceration rates? Or is it something else entirely?
Yeah, I was thinking about this as when the comments about the age versus education level. And, the age gradient shows up even if you kind of control for education. But what I don't remember, but I believe is the case, is that a large part of the differences across race and ethnicity, especially for black males, is a lot of that is operating through an education channel. So that is lower education levels on average for African American men compared to African American women and compared to white men and women. And that's part of the reason why they're the most cyclical group. It's also sort of on average true that because of the in part through their lower skill level, they're more likely to be working at least in construction, maybe a bit less in manufacturing, to get back to this industrial story that I told. So I think it also operates partially through the industrial story. I think the incarceration story you'd actually think would work in the opposite direction. That is, if you're sort of permanently in an out of the labor market state, either because you're not working in the conventional sector, or if you're incarcerated, you'd be less influenced by cycles. So I think the main channels are education and industry, but I think that there's something left over that I can't explain by those factors. I mean, that's what the models say.
My question is whether in the States there is a role for, let's call them, intergenerational informal transfer. Because the pattern that Professor Pinotti showed is likely to be partially offset and compensated by this informal transfer from fathers, mothers, and grandfathers and grandmothers to their kids. So how is it the same case in the States? Or?
I think an interesting difference, I mean, I certainly don't feel confident to give you a complete answer to this, but I think what I know is true is that the nature of intergenerational insurance, if you want to call it that, is prevalent in the way that Katya was talking about for low-educated families. That is, you move in with your mom, or she helps out with some groceries, or these sort of informal or living arrangements-based things. At the high end of the distribution, it tends to take the form more of you help your child buy a house or go to college or these big ticket items. I think in the middle is where I don't know very much. My suspicion is there's less going on across generations in the big middle of the income distribution in the United States compared to Europe, in part because of our higher mobility rates. We tend to be further away from, I live across 3,000 miles from my parents. I really like them, but somehow I found myself very far away from them. So it is really different in that way. And I think it must be true, although I'm speculating to some degree here, that is generating less of the kind of day-to-day transfers that you might be occurring in the Italian context to sort of offset that dramatic gradient that you showed us that I thought I was found very compelling. It's an interesting question.
You showed us some studies which show some positive effects of the safety net as far as poverty is concerned, where sort of government intervention led to at least the negative effects being cushioned to some extent. But at the same time, there's a lot of political opposition to such institutions and such intervention. Have you come across any sort of economic studies which favor that sort of the argument as well?
I mean, I think there's different ways you could look at that evidence that I showed you today. And I think part of it, one of the reasons why I've relied on comparing the Great Recession to the early 80s recession is it takes me away from I have my own view about how much protection the United States should provide, but that's not relevant. What's relevant is trying to evaluate how things are going. And I found myself constantly asking, well, compared to what? I don't know what to compare it to. And that's why I chose to compare it to pre-Great Recession patterns. Because it's an incredibly political situation. And the median voter probably would have voted to decrease these programs if they could have at the time. Obama managed to pass this stimulus, which was much smaller than many liberals wanted, but much bigger than many conservatives wanted. And despite the fact that it seemed the mounting evidence about what these programs do and why they can be helpful, there seemed to be a sort of evidence-free zone, is what's sometimes called. Like, you're not really talking about what the evidence is, and you're just talking about your beliefs about these things. So I've sort of thought long and hard about what the right question is that I wanted to answer, in part because I didn't want to be in that world. I wanted to be in the world of, well, what difference has, what was the counterfactual? The counterfactual was a world with policies that were maybe on the books in the early 80s, but that's a kind of hard thing to literally estimate, so instead I have sort of indirect evidence on it. Incomplete, not great, but a start in the right direction, I think, to try to understand how things are going.
We have another 10 minutes. Perhaps I ask you something, because there are a few things that came to my mind while listening to your great lecture. The Great Recession was clearly a stress test for the safety net, and the analysis that you carry out are really what we need. I mean, to learn from how the stress tests and how the safety net performed. However, there are elements that you don't know enough about. So, in particular, if you look at the very low end of the distribution, the real poor, there I think we should do more in knowing, the bottom really 1%. Like the same type of work that has been done for the top 1%, we should do something. We did something on the homeless people in Italy. Yeah. And this surveys came out suggesting that there has been a huge increase of the homeless people. So I wonder whether anything like that has been done, because that's really a test of a safety net during a recession. Right. So that was one thing. Yeah. The second is, in Europe we have an institution which is called short-time work, that has been very important to cope with rising unemployment, avoiding rising unemployment. It's something that, in the US you have very little of this. Right. It's very, very small. Perhaps that is an institution that cooperates better also with employment conditional incentives. So it's something that could make the EITC and all of these type of things working better also during recession, in combination of the two. Right. And the third thing is simply the labor market adjustment in the US has been this time involving a large and falling participation rates. Yes. So if the story of how does that cope with the fact that there has been this shift towards more in-work schemes? So if typically you would expect that this fall in participation occur after a recession in which you have been using this instrument that put people in long-term dependency, but this time you had a safety net that was much more involving in work. So it's strange that you got such a, perhaps there are other reasons independent of the safety net.
Those are three great questions. I'll see if I can try to remember them. The first one is, I think as soon as I looked at extreme poverty, I wanted to look further down. And unfortunately, the data just really aren't up to it. In fact, if you look at the income levels of the very lowest income individuals, we don't do a very good job of measuring it. Part of it might be the kinds of stories that Katya talked about in the other sources of income that don't show up when the surveyors ask you. Part of it is simply we see that our surveys are doing a worse job of capturing income in the United States than they did 20 years ago. And part of it seems to be the move from in-person to computer-based surveying. We don't know the full story. The great advantage of having administrative data that allows you to make these connections across the different ministries and the benefits that are provided across the different ministries and the tax authority and the labor market earnings, so that you're not relying on surveys, I think is the only way we can go to try to get a good sense of what's happening at the very bottom. And I think that the additional challenge with that is we really want to measure things at a family level, not at a person level, and then you've got another layer of complication. You don't just need to make connections across an individual and their ID number across these different programs and earnings and taxes, but you also need to make connections across the family members, because I think that's the right economic unit to be worried about. So I think there's a challenge in the data sense. And even the great new frontier in the United States with the work by Chetty and Saez and others taking advantage of the full universe of tax returns in the United States still misses this group, because you need to be working to be in the tax return world. And so there's a lot of missing data at the very bottom, and I think we don't really know the whole story. On the second thing,
It was a short-term work.
Short-time work, right, which is really not utilized in the United States at all. And I was actually talking to my daughter the other day about the context of instead of eliminating jobs, the sort of German model of reducing hours and spreading the pain more evenly across the population, which makes a hell of a lot of sense to me. And I've never heard it discussed, never raised. So it's a different kind of adjustment. And then the last one, I don't remember the third one. I remember the short term, and I don't remember the third one. But
It was on labor force participation.
Yes. So it's very much a huge debate right now among macro labor people about why it is that coming out of the Great Recession, I don't think I have it in any of the slides or I'd show it to you, we see the unemployment rate coming down, but the employment rate not going up. And part of the debate, there's sort of two parts to the debate. Part number one, how much of this is the hangover from the Great Recession, that is a cyclical component, that employment is not going up, because the generosity of the social safety net, and unemployment is coming down because discouraged workers are going down, but people aren't going back to work. Or whether or not it's sort of the continuation of a trend that started prior to the Great Recession. That is, if you look at the employment rate prior to the Great Recession, you see the beginning of what looks like a trend downward. Then part two of that people are thinking a lot about is, well, what explains the trend? The downward trend, if there is one. And part of that has been sort of accounted for by the demographics of the population and how old the baby boom is right now, approaching retirement and in retirement. But I think this we don't know. And I think we need more time to see what happens to the employment rate. But it's clear that the pattern of the secular employment rate coming out of the Great Recession doesn't look like other recessions. That's clear to the eye. But I think at this point, and I'm certainly not an expert on this, we don't know exactly what information is contained in there. But part of the debate is about and we were having a conversation earlier today about, well, why should I be using the unemployment rate on the right-hand side? Couldn't the direction of causation work in the other direction? That is, the more generous the unemployment system, the higher the unemployment rate, because you remain unemployed when the unemployment system is generous. And it's a valid point with the sort of simple descriptive exercise that I have here, and it's a complicated system with feedback. And you need a better, more micro-based lens, I think, to really try to parse out the work disincentive effects of the unemployment insurance system and its impact in a general equilibrium sense on the unemployment rate. And what I was doing today was not very well suited to get at that question.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for this great lecture, and so thank you also for the question. And this is simply to tell you that about next year lecture that will take place on October, so please write down and keep it on your agenda. There is time enough to prepare for this. It's October 15 and it will be at Lazir to give a 10th lecture of the Rodolfo Debenedetti Lecture. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.